Okay, everyone, thanks for coming out again. This time we are dealing with intelligence. That's why I still have my CIA, as you can see, almost CIA snake in a mural from Nicaragua, which I took the picture in Leon, Nicaragua. It's a very nice little picture. It's actually a mural, and that's what they do. So they paint murals and stuff like that. So basically, this is about intelligence. Now, it's not that countries shouldn't have intelligence. They obviously should have intelligence, right? But how intelligent is the intelligence, right? So that's what we want to talk about here. And I got a little sun. I think I'm too red. I don't know. But regardless of that, the goal of this is not to get too bogged down in all these articles, although the articles are good, like the politicization. But the goal is, what is politicization? The reason I do this week after the psychology week is we talked about like confirmation bias, right? You seek out information that supports your ideas, right? And then you ignore, through cognitive dissonance, information that's contrary to that. That's basically, in a nutshell, politicization. Now, there's different reasons for it. Maybe, for example, a policymaker, if you took my national security class, puts pressure on someone to give the information they want. And maybe the other way is a political analyst wants to further her or his career, so they basically give information that a policymaker wants. But regardless, that's what politicization is. It's not an objective understanding of the world. Now, can we even have an objective understanding of the world? I don't know. And that's one of the problems with intelligence in general, because we want to cling to the information that supports our ideas. One of the best examples is William Casey under the Reagan administration. I mean, he literally would tell people, right, if you find evidence that Soviet influence is in Central America, because that's during a time of, upheavals, the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua, guerrillas in Guatemala, El Salvador, etc. He said, I want to hear about it. If you find the contrary, which was probably true, I don't want to hear it. So he basically didn't want to hear information that contradicted his worldview. And that is what politicization is. And that's why the article from Trump to the Bush administration with weapons of mass destructions in Iraq, and the stovepiping. That's very important. In a nutshell, some of these articles are very dense. I don't want you to, you can read these to the extent to which you want, but to understand what stovepiping is, there was actually no vetting of the information. So they were coming down, and basically Cheney and others, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, etc., wanted that information. They didn't want it vetted by the CIA or other intelligence agency. They didn't trust them. And, these are a bunch of Harvard people. They're not necessarily liberal like Bernie Sanders, but, we're not on the same side. So they basically, when I was solicited by the CIA after I got back from Nicaragua, what I would have been is a political analyst. Nothing covert, because, all they would have to do is hold lunch from me and I would give them all the information they want. Being tortured, no way. So a political analyst in an office on Central American, Latin American affairs. What they would want me to do is vet this information. Now, there are different ways to do that. I do the statistics class. I do a lot of coding and things like that, so we can kind of objectively understand the world. But most people don't want to objectively understand the world, right? And when you look at the Iraq War, is a great example. They believed in a man named Ahmad Chalabi. Ahmad Chalabi was basically an Iraqi snake that said, he was going to be a hero of Iraq. He can help overthrow Saddam Hussein. He's going to be the next president, etc. The people of Iraq didn't want him. He lost. He won maybe when there was an election in Iraq, he got like 2% of the vote. We do this all the time. In Venezuela, Maria Machado was getting a ton of money through her NGO supported by the United States against Hugo Chavez. She was not popular at all. In her own party, she couldn't make more than 2% of the vote in the primary. Enrique Bermudez destroyed her and then ran against Hugo Chavez, and he lost a fair election, Enrique Bermudez. Capriles. So the thing is that we support a lot of these people thinking that they're winners when they're really losers. Enrique Bermudez was a former somocista in Nicaragua. He was the head of the National Guard. He was a mass murderer. He was the most hated figure of the Somoza government. And if you read Colin Powell's book, Colin Powell says great things about him, even though he's a mass murderer. Enrique Bermudez really cares about his country, Nicaragua. Yeah, he cared about killing people. But the Sandinistas, who were against the Somoza government and overthrew them in 1979, liked that the CIA and Colin Powell and others were supporting Enrique Bermudez because he was such a negative face of the counter-revolutionaries in Nicaragua. We don't really understand what's going on in other countries. And Enrique Bermudez was hated by the more organic anti-Sandinista movement. Those were guerrilla groups trying to overthrow the government of Nicaragua at the time. They were called the Contra against. And what you need to understand is we were supporting people who no one really liked in Nicaragua, just like Ahmad Chalabi. No one liked him in Iraq. Juan Guaido in Venezuela. We supported a coup in Venezuela, which failed miserably. We don't understand these kinds of governments, and we just want to see the world how we want to see it. So this is a failure of intelligence, and it's not just the U.S. intelligence. It can be any intelligence agency. But this becomes problematic because then we don't objectively look at a problem. We can't see outside the scope of our own biases. Eduardo Segarra, what you're going to read about, was actually a double agent, or here, because it's a podcast, for Cuba. And the United States of America was supporting him, thinking he was a spy on the Cuban government. But what they didn't understand is that he actually loved his own government, not necessarily Castro, but, and he was a double agent giving information to Cuba. So they were like double agents. It's very, very interesting. Double agents is you think they're helping you, but they're really giving that information back to the host government. So in this case, Eduardo Segarra, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, was giving information back to the Cuban government. It's a very interesting thing. And, and then you started seeing the CIA trying to kill Castro, the overthrow of Allende, I want to say 1973 in Chile, and a lot of others. You saw the propaganda video in Guatemala. They were participated in a lot of horrible things. And that's when you had what they call the family jewels, where all this information, like a big piñata, boom, and all the candy. Well, it's supposed to be candy. If you have a piñata in my house, I just put in things I find around the house, like tape, nails, things like that, because these are I don't want these kids running around my house. You know what I mean? I'm not going to spend money on them. So anyways, it's like a big piñata, boom, all this information comes out. Remember, this is before internet, before WikiLeaks, etc. So all this information comes out, and there was these church committees and other committees, the church committee after I believe, Idaho senator, talking about the horrible things the CIA and other intelligence agencies are doing abroad. Like, the Congo was a horrible thing, how we were supposed to kill Patrice Lumumba of the Congo. That was the African country where after they had independence, a very popular leader came about, and it got caught up in the Cold War, and we wanted to kill him because he wasn't, quote unquote, on our side. But see, these are the horrible things. And when you see an Angola video where Castro actually sent troops in, one of the things interesting about that is we sent in, as you'll see, Stockwell, who I really like now because he's very honest and objective, talked about how those people we sent in, the CIA trained, etc., were psychopaths into Angola. And I know I'm jumping around here, but the general goal to understand is that we see the world in our own vision, right? And that could be any vision. And then we have the tendency to marginalize any information that does not fit our worldview. And that's what politicization is. And for me, this becomes extremely detrimental to foreign policy because when you watch the Angola video where Castro actually sent troops to Angola, which wasn't necessarily popular in Cuba, but I mean, he destroyed all the troops. The reason we didn't send troops in, it was after Vietnam, and we had the Vietnam syndrome. So the United States of America didn't want to send troops in because it wasn't popular, obviously, Vietnam, so we weren't ready to send in other troops. And that's very, very important to understand. So what is the CIA doing right and wrong? And then there's another article I really like where it talks about what did the CIA get wrong in the Ukraine about the Russian invasion. And is it always wrong? It's not always wrong. I used to give an article on Superman. He was a CIA operative that was helping, although then Fujimori kind of fell out of popularity with the Peruvian people to stop the guerrilla group Shining Path in Peru. There are hits for the CIA and other intelligence agencies. Remember, when you see the links, I'm going to put up links to, there are many different intelligence agencies, too many to really go through in depth here. But I think that this is a very interesting point about politicization, the Iraq war, and what goes on historically with the intelligence agencies, because don't forget the NSA, the National Security Act, was to create a non-ad hoc, more professional governmental agencies like the CIA, right, after World War II. However, how professional is it? And then you get into like the 2004 reforms after they failed with 9/11. And a lot of people point out, I used to use a book, it's a little dated now, so I don't use it in this class anymore, but we still read his articles by Pillar. And his argument, the 2004 Reform Act, was just creating more bureaucracy and didn't really help. The CIA was the biggest loser. If you've taken any of my other classes, I stress this, in this 2004 Act, because basically the United States of America, the CIA was the king of intelligence, and then it kind of lost it. And I believe the first one was a very political appointee. After the 2004 Act, they created, a new kind of director. It's no longer the CIA, and that was Negroponte, who was a kind of a failure in Honduras and just a bushy. So, the goal is, are we really with reforms, right? Whatever reform they are, I'm referring more to the 2004 reform. Are they really reforming intelligence agencies, or are we just creating more bureaucracy, more politicization, etc.? Because people really get all hyped up with the word reform, right? Oh my God, we're going to reform, Yeah, the word reform is a big thing, reform. But when you look at the actual reform, we might not be reforming as well as we think we are. And that's important for intelligence up until the present day, right? Because it's still bureaucratic. And that's one of the problems in general, I think, with intelligence, is that you have all these agencies. And as we talked about before with the bureaucratic politics model, why do they not, like, say, share the information? Why do they hoard information, etc.? They want to be the ones to have this information. People don't like to share information because then they might lose credibility, they might lose funding, etc. So I think agencies in general, even at universities, are very much agencies, or different, departments are at each other's throat for funding, for other reasons. They don't want to share this information. So it's very difficult to depoliticize any kind of institution. As Woodrow Wilson once said, I ran for president to get out of politics, because he was at Princeton University. So the thing about this is interesting is, can you ever get rid of politicization? I think we can look at the world more objectively, but most people just don't want to, right? So if you basically want to think that there's Soviet influence in the upheavals in Central America in the 1980s, then that's what you're going to think, regardless of the information. And I think that's one of the reasons why. And then you get into more with intelligence. I mean, we can't get bogged down into it too much now. Torture, Guantanamo Bay, etc. Should they waterboard? Shouldn't they? That's something that's a good question to ask. Maybe I'll ask it on the discussion board. Should they or shouldn't they torture? Should we use these? And like I said, all countries need an intelligence agencies, but what kind of limitations do we put on these agencies? A lot of people have seen the CIA and other intelligence agencies. Remember, all the, everything from the Secretary of Trade have intelligence agencies. So are they worthy of praise, or do we kind of lift them up too much and expect too much? That's kind of Lowenthal and Pillar's argument. Predicting is too much for these intelligence agencies. Maybe we can kind of, get some information from them, but don't have too much of high hopes because the world is so complex. And don't forget, one of the things about the limits is that's a very important concept, and I'll end with that, and then I'll go over the main points, is that number one, well, these are the main points, but about the limitations is that, the FBI and the CIA are great examples. These are two examples of how they're completely different. The FBI was going after a group called the Weather Underground, right? As you see in the video. And the reason those people got off scot-free is because the FBI stepped on their civil rights. They need a grand jury. That's why we have like the RICO Act to make it easier to go after mafia people, etc. The CIA doesn't care. If the CIA is waterboarding people, you can't go into a grand jury and say, how'd you get this information? Well, we were waterboarded. Well, right there, then they're not going to listen to it. So that is the FBI and the CIA, a different beast. One's created by the Justice Department, the FBI, whereas the CIA does not have those limitations. And that's important to understand, because if the CIA fails to have these kinds of limitations, or other intelligence agencies, particularly abroad, what are we doing? Are they doing a lot of illegal acts like the family jewels and other information have figured out and have, shed light on this. And this is what we're going to do with the final assignment with the National Security Archives. But, how do we put limitations on there? There has been movements in Congress. And Congress usually, and the Supreme Court, does not get involved in U.S. foreign policy. But when there's a scandal, like the Church Committee, when they're finding out we were trying to kill Castro with crazy ways, like blowing up his cigar, like all those are true. Those kinds of stories that it was showing, Allende, Guatemala, 1954, Iran, 1953, all these horrible things the CIA were doing. Congress, there begins to be pressure, and Congress gets involved. And then the same thing happened after 9/11. That's why we have the 2004 Reform Act. And then with torture, Guantanamo Bay, etc. So we want to put limits on them, but those limits aren't always that strong, because, as I said, the FBI is a completely different creature than the CIA. So to recap, I want to focus on a few things. Now, we could talk about intelligence forever. One, what is politicization? It's related to the psychology that we talked about before, where you're just basically ignoring information, your confirmation bias, confirming your own opinions, and ignoring all that information. That can be by political analysts or the policymakers themselves. The policymakers themselves can put pressure on political analysts, and political analysts can try to give policymakers what they want, essentially. The second point is, with that said, we create a lot of bad policy. There were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. We have these stovepipes where a lot of policymakers, in this case, the Bush administration, did not want to listen to any of what we call vetting process, that is analyzing the information to see, what is true and what isn't, because, a lot of human intelligence that is coming from human intelligence might be wrong. You're dealing with very sensitive, sometimes psychotic people who look for intelligence, and look for attention, money, a way to get in the United States, etc. Are they telling the truth? No, they just may be saying. And are they representative of the people, like Ahmad Chalabi? My mistake, my Arabic isn't that great. Juan Guaido, Maria Machado, those two of Venezuela. They're not as representative as we'd like to see. Enrique Bermudez of Nicaragua, etc. Diem of Vietnam, where we were supporting him, and the Buddhist monks were literally out burning themselves in protest, where he was not what we would like of him to have been, right? So all these kind of scandals that I think are attributable to politicization and the lack of limitations by intelligence agencies, creates tension, bad policies, and then Congress kind of rears its ugly head. A lot of ugly people in Congress, just kidding you. But anyways, and then there's finally, pressure to do something. And that's kind of like, a general story of intelligence. you know, and then you obviously get torture. So then Congress gets involved, you know, do people want waterboarding or not? But there's a lot of bad policy attributable to all this. The fact that there's no limitation on the CIA and other agencies, and that there's a lot of politicization going on. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying, you know, no country shouldn't have intelligence agencies. Of course we should, right? But we have to be a little more judicial with them. It's kind of like, for me, intelligence is a lot like war. Countries will use war too much. Once you become a power like the United States, now Russia, etc., we throw around our military too much. It's the same thing with intelligence. We throw it around too much, right? And you start seeing that, and we have caused a lot of harm. That's why I actually lived in Nicaragua, like behind me, because we created an illegal war in that country, and there were a lot of innocent people who got, you know, killed, hurt, raped, etc. And in fact, the Nicaraguan government in the 1980s took the United States to court and won, and that was because there was a released CIA manual saying that the CIA was encouraging other Nicaraguans and other people to kind of create terrorism in the country, to destabilize the country. And, you know, it was a terrible, terrible situation for this very poor Central American country where I lived 8 years. I wasn't there at that time, but I thought, you know, it's somewhat my duty to help the world out. And there's in its self-interest. It's exciting for me. You're learning another language, etc. So, but this is very important to understand. So intelligence can be useful, but at the same time, one useful is the cultural way, and I talk about this in my national security, and I'll just end with a usefulness, is that understanding cultures of countries like Cuba, and that's related to the Angola video, is that when there started to be baseball fields all over Africa, they realized, oh, the Cubans are getting involved. And intelligence was good during the Cuban Missile Crisis and other areas. So it's not that we shouldn't have intelligence. My point, and you do not have to agree with me, is one, we have to try our best to be objective. It's way too politicized. But moreover, we need to break from our US-centric view of the world, essentially. But moreover, we need limits on intelligence. It's kind of like this rogue organization, particularly the CIA, where the FBI is not. That's why the FBI has to follow rules, because when you're being taken to a grand jury, you can't say we're waterboarding. That's how the Weather Underground got out. And to end, there is an interesting assignment. You have to go to actually the National Security Archives housed in George Washington University and pick any archival documents or the original documents about intelligence. It could be from the Soviet Union days, you know, us fighting the Soviet Union. I say fight in quotes, or anything else, you know, the CIA in Latin America, CIA anywhere in Asia, etc. And go look at a document and just, you know, briefly talk about it. Because that, I want you to get used to kind of looking through this information if you ever want to do research and stuff, and it could be good for your paper. It's a really kind of cool exercise. So without further ado, I want to thank everyone for coming out and listening to me. Again, my background is the CIA. I've used it quite a bit, but we'll change backgrounds next time. Take care, everyone. I hope everyone is well.